Thank you very much, Pat. Revenge is sweet. And we can resume normal hostilities after this, I hope. Anyway, thank you very much for coming here out of the cold and into the cold. I guess you've come here tonight hoping to hear some intelligent words about the state of media power in the UK today. Maybe you've come here to try and hear some gossip about whether Jeremy Corbyn is indeed planning to take on media moguls, as it is rumoured he has promised to do. Maybe you've come here because it actually does say this on the publicity, that you want to hear about the prospects for media reform. But actually, I have to say that when I am standing in this room, and I don't come in this room, sadly I'm not a music student, I don't come in this room, apart from I think the last student occupation I may have visited, but beyond that, this does take me back, because my memory of this room is from about 10 years ago. I was standing here teaching a very large undergraduate class on culture and communication, some very important piece of social theory, when a pigeon flew in that window up there and occupied the space for the next hour above my head, not moving for the entire hour. Now, as my friends gathered here know, I hate pigeons. I'm not exactly scared, I just really despise pigeons. So it was very off-putting. It must have been the low point of my teaching career, by far, just being observed from on high by what I probably still consider vermin. Now, why am I telling you this true story? Well, rest assured, I would never be so crude as to suggest that pigeons could somehow be seen as metaphors for press barons, for top politicians, or indeed for professors hovering above all the action and occasionally defecating on the individuals below. The real reason I tell this story about pigeons is because, and I remember this as if it was yesterday, I completely lost the attention of all the students for that whole hour, who were glued to the bird and obviously spent an hour wondering if the pigeon would do what pigeons do. So I'm hoping I keep your attention a little bit more successfully for the next 45 minutes to an hour, when I want to talk about the prospects for making our media more democratic, more accountable, more representative to the audiences, that is, the real people like you in this room, who depend on its narratives for so much of our lives. And what I would want to do briefly to start with is just to explain to put all of this in context before moving on to look at some of the main debates and strategies around media reform and media policy research. And it's a big context, so you have to necessarily narrow it down. But for me, at least as I see it, the main context is that we're facing a crisis at the heart of our media system. And by that I mean with the dominant players across the media landscape, a crisis on so many different levels of funding, of ethics, of representation, and of legitimacy. Now, normally, and many people in this room will have experience of this, the idea of a media in crisis is often reduced simply to changing technological conditions in which some business models necessarily, almost inevitably and automatically, are displaced by new ones. So, for example, we have the argument that newspapers have been fatally wounded by the nimble startups of the digital age. Or we have the argument that old-fashioned linear television is to be replaced imminently by upstarts like Netflix and Amazon. There are nuggets of truth clearly in both of those propositions, but neither proposition is completely true, in that evidence suggests that newspapers are still crucial instruments for shaping the daily political agenda. And in fact, although it seems counterintuitive, TV audiences in this country have actually risen over the last 10 years, with the vast majority of viewing still continuing to be linear rather than on demand, despite all the changes in that landscape. So it's not just a technological crisis, and so I'm not just going to talk about a technological future that I or no one else can really guess. The crisis I'm referring to is one related to the increasingly unequal distribution of resources in our media landscape. Just as we have had new figures this week, it came out a couple of days ago, showing how a tiny minority of the world's wealth is controlled by a handful of extraordinarily rich individuals, we have a media environment which is structured by similar inequalities. This is a landscape characterized by the domination of attention, audiences and agendas by a relatively small number of very powerful companies, both offline and online, all of whom have very close associations with the highest levels of our political system. Companies, I hardly need to name them, like Sky, News UK, Google, Facebook, the Daily Mail, and of course we shouldn't forget the BBC. Now, I do want to make something immediately clear, which is I do not think that these organisations work together seamlessly as some kind of cohesive unit. And in fact, as Pat alluded to, I've written on the contradictions of media power, the fact that audiences and media organisations are certainly not always in tune with each other. And actually, what we refer to as the media refers to a variety of different cultures, routines and institutions. But nevertheless, given that I don't have 3.5 hours, much as I would love to have that to talk to you, it's shorthand and allows me to talk about the way in which they may share some systemic features that I want to outline. So let me very briefly run through 3 elements of this crisis. The first is a problem with trust. Now, classical liberal theory tells us that our independent media ought to be crucial instruments for holding powerful bodies to account and for representing the views and experiences of ordinary people. They are, after all, supposed to be the fourth estate. Yet our trust in them remains surprisingly, for me, maybe I'm naive, surprisingly low. The Edelman Trust Report actually came out this morning, and it shows that under 1/3 of the UK population trust the media as a whole. And what's interesting, but you may not be that surprised about this, is that top earners, those over £100,000 a year, trust the media far, far more than the poorest, those who have a household income of under £15,000 a year. 54% to 26%, more than double, presumably because the wealthy perceive that the media that we have represents their interests much more effectively and adequately than do the poorest people. But it gets worse. Only 22% of the UK population trust journalists in particular to tell the truth, in contrast to, for example, the 90% who trust doctors to tell the truth. And you kind of have to believe me in this, because the last figure I read was that 72% of the British public trust professors still to tell the truth. But anyway, you have 22% who trust journalists and 90% who trust doctors, which means, I guess, that we have far more confidence in the ability of surgeons to operate on journalists than we do in journalists to report on doctors, which may tell you something about the recent coverage of the junior doctors' strike, I guess. Anyway, some people, and I've had this put to me at an audience of journalists, will tell you that this is how it should be. This is the way it should be. If journalists are trusted, if journalists are liked, then it means that they're doing something wrong. They're not asking the tough questions, which ought to make them unpopular. But for me, it seems to be the opposite of what's happening. To the extent that we don't trust our news media, it's because we feel that they are far too intertwined with power, far too closely associated with powerful groups, precisely the powerful groups that they are supposed to be reporting on. That for every Leveson inquiry, there are far more opportunities for Rupert Murdoch to pop into number 10 to have a quiet chat, as he did 10 times in the last year, or he might pop next door to speak to George Osborne, the Chancellor, just before stitching up a licence fee deal with the BBC, as he did twice in the summer. For every MP's expenses scandal, there are far more occasions when our news media amplify, or at least fail to challenge, a comfortable consensus around, for example, the legitimacy of airstrikes, or Jeremy Corbyn's alleged inadequacies, or indeed the need for austerity. And I think, to a degree that ought to be a matter of huge public concern, the media are institutions both with and of power. The second element of the crisis is that we are seeing the reshaping of the European communications environment, with the embedding of a market logic and the weakening of both public institutions and public accountability. There are, to differing extents in different countries, but increased levels of concentrated ownership across Europe, while at the same time there are declining obligations on companies to provide meaningful details on ownership structures and influences, so that in many parts of Europe, it's very hard to figure out who actually has control of the media organisations that are responsible for providing you with the daily narratives. Let me give one more example of the transformation of this landscape as it relates to broadcasting in particular, and that is the increasing polarisation between private operators and public service media across Europe. You have a situation where the 5 top private television companies across Europe had the same revenue as all the other 57 members of the European Broadcasting Union put together. 5 private companies are as big as the total public service media across Europe. While many public service broadcasters are experiencing severe economic difficulties, you find that the top 12 European commercial groups are actually doing pretty well. Their income is now more than 50% greater than their public service counterpart, and what's revealing is that this gap has nearly doubled in the last 5 years. This is a growing gap, the polarisation between the private media economy on one hand and a shrinking public service media on the other. The growing gap that you find between rich and poor, between the 1% and the 99%, to use the old saying, I think clearly finds and increasingly finds an echo inside large parts of the media economy. Yet this is rarely the story that's told, at least inside the UK. It's not the one that appears to be driving policy, where you have commercial lobbyists who are determined to scale back the operations of public service operators. So we're facing the prospect of the privatisation, for example, of Channel 4, despite evidence that its capacity to fund original UK programmes, that capacity would be severely curbed if it was owned by a for-profit operator. We're also facing, as you know, the likelihood of a smaller BBC, given that last year's Green Paper was predicated on the fact that the sole problem with the BBC is its size. Not its history, its performance, its culture, its managerialism, but its size. Despite the fact that it is significantly smaller than Sky, a question which is never raised in the policy environment, and of course it's getting smaller in comparison. And above all, the tone of the Green Paper is that we need to minimise the impact of the BBC on its commercial rivals. Now this raises for me a major issue, because we shouldn't judge the NHS on the basis of whether it makes life difficult for private health providers. We shouldn't curb public investment in schools in case this hits the profits of independent schools and so-called crowds out commercial competition. And so we shouldn't judge the performance of the BBC in terms of its impact on the marketplace. We should judge it simply on whether it adequately serves the interests of its audiences, of licence fee payers, of the public. And actually the real problem for me is that in its desire to placate Treasury mandarins, government ministers and corporate lobbyists, it has embarked on a series of cuts, dropping sports, dropping channels. As we know, BBC Three is soon to be an online-only channel in the next couple of months. It has embarked on a news agenda that, as a study from Cardiff University found, quote, tends to reproduce a conservative pro-business version of the world, quite different to the story you would read in many newspapers arguing that it's a pro-European and anti-business view of the world. This follows what Justin Schlossberg has referred to as a tightening of the editorial reins and a growing climate of caution since the corporation was severely criticised by the Hutton Inquiry, if you remember that, following the Iraq War in 2003, its last major run-in with government. I don't like to raise awkward events of very topical though, so how could I resist it? Was I surprised that the timing of Michael Dougal's resignation a couple of weeks ago was choreographed by senior journalists at the BBC to coincide with Prime Minister's questions and deliberately to embarrass Jeremy Corbyn? No, I wasn't surprised at all, but I have to say that yes, I was a little shocked by just how brazenly this hit-and-run operation had been orchestrated. The third feature of the crisis in media concerns what you might call or at least what I would call in academic language, the evisceration of the meaning of key policy objectives by neoliberal actors and following heavy-duty lobbying. We could see this in particular in relation to debates, many debates, I've only got time to touch on two, concerning media pluralism that Pat's mentioned and press freedom. Now, pluralism is a concept that's used in Europe to denote the fact that that the policy objective ought to be that we have a sufficient number of outlets that would support a range of diverse voices. Now, this is supposed to be a foundational principle that does two things. First, to provide citizens with a full range of information, and second, to break up undue concentrations of power. But recent policy debates, as many colleagues in the room will back me up on, have been dominated much more by a commitment to secure pluralism that sees it not in terms of the fair distribution of media power, but much more overwhelmingly related to the promotion simply of consumer choice, of maybe making the menu a little longer, but not really ever looking at what is served and the need to cater to very different audiences and tastes. There's a similar evisceration of the meaning of press freedom, I would argue, whereby the ability of journalists to hold power to account through independent investigation and to secure their citizens' right to know has been squeezed by a new determination to associate such liberties with the rights almost exclusively of corporations to speak as they wish. So that we've had in the UK, for the last few years, there has been a fierce and thus far, sadly, highly effective backlash against government proposals. For many of us, actually quite modest government proposals for a new royal charter on press self-regulation, a backlash that has been led by newspaper proprietors claiming that only they and their titles are the guarantors of press freedom. Only they can be trusted with a mantle of hundreds of years of press freedom. And this is despite the fact that it was their activities, the industrial scale of phone hacking, the privileged access of proprietors to politicians, and the press's refusal to tolerate a fully independent audit of its activities that have so massively lowered the credibility and the trust, as I've already referred to, of so many news organisations in the public's eyes. It was interesting, just to backtrack, that the headline in The Independent about the Edelman Trust Barometer, indicating that only less than a third of the British public trust the media, the headline was growing trust in dominant news brands, not the fact that 2/3 of the people in this country do not trust the media that we continue to consume. So what do we do about these problems? How do we start to restore public trust? How do we start to curb the power of unaccountable groups to dominate media spaces? How do we start to introduce more robust and adequate and fitting and socially just policy principles? Well, that's the end of the context, and this is the beginning of the discussion of where media reform comes in and where the title of the talk actually finally becomes relevant, which is that I think we need to do three things do I need to say it again? To be the media. I don't need to look at my notes for this. To be the media, to know the media, and to change the media. So let me start briefly with, I just want to rattle over them very quickly. In terms of being the media, I should say that Gollum added a fourth one, but it's not appropriate to say it in polite company. So I will stick to three of them. The first dimension of media reform acknowledges that if publics cannot rely on the most powerful existing instruments of media to adequately represent their lives as they are lived and to hold power to account, and if, crucially, we have online environments which are all too often replicating the monopoly structures and the commercial orientations of the analogue systems that they were supposed to have replaced, then it makes sense. We need to do something different to make our own media, to tell our own stories, and to highlight our own voices. Now, this relates to the theory and the practice of alternative media, which draws on participatory accounts of democracy in order to produce media that better engage with and reflect the diversity of the population. I imagine the kinds of media sources that many of you depend on or complement. You know, you have a rich diet of media, I'm sure, whereby you might consume some of the major news titles or information sources along with all sorts of other forms of alternative media. So you have alternative news outlets which aim to produce content which goes beyond, as I see it, what they would argue is the false objectivity of mainstream news. You have community media which tend to avoid sensationalist and commercial formats with voices and methods of organising and production that seek to be more democratic and, very importantly, I think, to talk in the language and the register of their audiences. Now, there's nothing new, and again, my other 3.5, if I'm ever invited back, I would love to go through the whole history of a very rich history of alternative media, because as long as we've had a media, James, am I right? We've always had a response, we've always had an alternative media, because the dominant media has never been able adequately to satisfy and truly represent all the citizens of any of the countries in which it finds itself. The alternative media has always been a counterpoint to what it describes as the mainstream media. So you have the wonderful stories of the Chartist press in this country back in the 1840s, which provided early trade unionists with an essential organising tool, given the hostility towards their campaigns from the official and so-called establishment titles. Now, in the age of digital media, we are, in theory, much better able to realise the vision of a horizontal and an interactive communication system that allows for the mobilisation of audiences as producers and allows for the possibilities of content that defies an artificially narrow consensus, though, as I've already suggested, we should stress that these structures are, even though we are increasingly dependent on them, these structures are far from immune from the grip of commercial interests and priorities. So there is a rich history, a rich literature, rich practices around being the media in response to the other media that we have. Secondly, knowing the media. Media studies is a field which by definition is attempting to fully know the media as it has been established and as it operates. And that by encouraging critical readings of popular text and popular institutions, media academics aim to grasp the very complex dynamics of all these structures, except that when we do this, we are accused very often of glorifying the trivial, the temporary, or often the talentless, often is held against us. But weirdly enough, we're also told the opposite, that just as we're glorifying the trivial and the superficial, we're also told that we're glorifying something much worse. I saw references to a social services leaflet in one London borough, which recently, just last week, produced a leaflet aimed specifically at combating signs of radicalisation amongst young people, which argued, in their words, that, quote, showing a mistrust of mainstream media reports could be evidence that children are being groomed by extremists. Now, I think it's fair to say, which does put media studies in a bit of a disadvantage, I guess. I think it's fair to say that the only radicalisation strategy that me and my fantastic colleagues in the department are interested in is one that relates to cultivating the ability of students to think independently, to think critically, and not to take for granted the symbolic mechanisms that attempt to render certain stories natural and familiar. There's many we could name here, but for example, that men are natural experts given their systematic overrepresentation in appearances on broadcast news as experts, or for example, that benefit claimants are scroungers, as we have seen in a whole slew of poverty porn programs. Now, when I was thinking about this word, Kirsty will forgive me, every night there's suddenly a light bulb goes off at the most inopportune moment. And I remember I was thinking about familiarity, what the media does, making things familiar. And it did honestly take me back to maybe not the most exciting parts of my undergraduate times. There may have been other things that I won't talk about now. But the debates I remember really clearly that really excited me were aesthetic, this is true, I'm not just trying to sound intelligent here, honestly, I still have the book and it is well thumbed. Am I right? Yes. And it's aesthetic debates involving Russian formalists in the 1920s. So stick with me here, because they argued, in pretty different circumstances, that the most powerful and the most poetic art relied on a process of defamiliarization, about making the familiar seem strange. About making the familiar seem strange. The best known of them, a man called Victor Shklovsky, wrote about how artists, in particular artists like Tolstoy, interrupt our immediate sensory perceptions and make the world strange in order to enhance our aesthetic experience. Now, that was a debate, and a very complicated debate, about aesthetic strategies, much more than about political circumstances. Indeed, it was actually a rejection of some of the political debates that were going around in Soviet Russia at the time. But I'm tempted to argue that we should embrace this concept of defamiliarization if we are to know the media, and to challenge the idea that the representations and perspectives that are so effortlessly and elegantly proposed in newsrooms and in costume dramas are in any way natural. Critical media studies can defamiliarize our world, make our world look strange and beautiful, and if we put it back together in a different way, actually make it look new. And I have to say, as an aside, I personally think the BBC's new version of War and Peace actually really does the opposite of what Shklovsky was saying. For me, it makes the strange, the phenomenon of wars and revolutions, look a bit familiar, more than the other way around. But anyway, we can carry on this discussion in the pub. Sorry, let me move on. And this process of defamiliarization is also precisely what I try to do in my work on media policy that Pat was referring to, and to build on the arguments of people like Robert McChesney, who argue that just as our media systems aren't in any sense natural, but created in the shape of vested interests that dominate at any one time, media policy as well is a highly political, value-laden, interest-driven field. Now, I apologise for talking about media policy. You're bound at this difficult moment a bit more than halfway through the talk, to start to switch off, because most people do when they hear me or other people talk about media policy. And that is exactly the problem, because a set of decisions that are taken about a sphere of activity that occupies our waking lives more than any other single sphere of activity, measured in hours spent, not in importance necessarily, you can discuss that, but a set of decisions take about this very important sphere of activity is so often seen as distant from us, as dull, as too technical, as reliant on experts. It's just seen as out of our hands. So, as my students will testify, I am basically an evangelist when it comes to this, trying to make media policy exciting and interesting by encouraging people to challenge foundational assumptions, practices and agendas, and then, crucially, to mobilise and intervene in efforts to transform both the terms of debate but also the structures themselves. That is the third element of the trilogy of the title, that we need to change and not just to be and to know the media. Because as valuable and enjoyable as alternative media and critical knowledge surely are, I would nevertheless claim that they are insufficient without a strategy for radical change. Now, why is that? Well, for many reasons. Let me give two. First, there is a risk, I think, in equating being the media with freeing the media. In particular, the emphasis on alternative communication networks and horizontal forms of organisation has led to a failure to confront in any meaningful sense the concentrations of media power with huge symbolic influence and institutional resilience. Todd Wolfson's fantastic study of what he describes of the cyber left, networks of individuals involved in indie media centres and the Occupy movement, is very instructive here. While welcoming their energy and their contribution to cycles of protest, he argues that the cyber left were ultimately unsuccessful due to a number of shortcomings, including a failure to consider capitalism at the systemic level, a tendency to prioritise technology over social relationships, an underlying resistance to all forms of hierarchy and leadership that weaken their capacity for effective action, and finally a failure to involve and mobilise all individuals irrespective of their backgrounds and networks. I guess it's one way of saying we shouldn't romanticise the ability of being the media to change the world around it. And second, very obvious point, is that even the most sophisticated understanding of the cultural, political, economic or philosophical dynamics of media institutions and practices doesn't provide any kind of guaranteed challenge to the existing order of things unless it is complemented by and feeds into a wider political strategy of active opposition. So we need creativity, we need knowledge, but we also need activism if we are to produce different and more accountable forms of representation through our media. So be the media, know the media, change the media. Now, the main reason I chose this slogan, if I'm entirely honest, is that in some weird way, it echoes the direction of travel in my own professional life. So it just felt like it was worth talking about. It did have a resonance with my development, because I started out from a very early age making media. And in fact, I can't remember what the first creative thing I ever did was, but I remember at the age of 12, I did make a film called Away Day. I was 12 years old, I was interested in public transport, like you are. And family folklore has it that I used a Super 8 camera, and I filmed all of it without any film in the camera. So thankfully there's no evidence of this now. Pat's already made reference to my music journalism. I was a bit more successful as a music journalist. I was a 17-year-old office boy in New York working for a very big rock magazine, and I suddenly realised that I needed to go to the editors and say, I phrased it as new wave people. They were punks. They were the people I listened to. I said, you should check out this music. They were like, well, we don't know what it is. Why don't you go and do it? So obviously that was the most enjoyable 12 months of my life, just getting to interview anyone I liked, and I shouldn't have given it up just to go to university, but never mind. After that, together with friends in this room, I was involved in the burgeoning independent production movement in the early 1980s when Channel 4 was launched. And then I moved to ITN as a program researcher, and I remember, and this is when I was, working in the media taught you a lot, but it didn't teach you everything. And it became crystal clear one day. I wish I'd known you at the time, because you would have helped to answer this question. I was on my way to the loo, in the basement of the old building at Wells Street in central London, and there was a little A4 piece of paper on the wall, and it said something like, "We would like to remind all members of staff that Londonderry/Derry is only to be referred to as Londonderry." That was it. This was the official, and I thought, how did that happen? Who took that decision? What were the circumstances in which that decision was made? And what kind of comeback might we have to discuss, given the fact that it is now officially Derry Londonderry? And that made me start to think, and I think that was enough to suggest that I needed answers beyond that which was able to be gathered from working at ITN. That's my fancy answer. The other answer is that I applied to be a tape editor, but I failed the test because I'm red-green colourblind, as if my colleagues must have figured this out after all these years. Anyway, I then went into teaching, after 3 weeks with my squarial at British Satellite Broadcasting, and then in higher education. I've loved the opportunity to ask fundamental questions, both about the structure and the allure of our media industries ever since. But obviously I have increasingly tried in recent years to complement my academic research with a commitment to transform the very structures and principles that I had been trying to be and know. And together with colleagues Angela, James and Natalie from our department, we set up the Media Reform Coalition in 2011 after the phone hacking crisis, and since then we have been campaigning against abuses of media power, for changes to media ownership rules, both to check the power of the largest media groups, but also to give, crucially, to give marginalised voices better representation and funding. So if my own journey somehow epitomises this media reform story, what do we need to do now? What consequences does it have for media policy? So in this context that I've described of a loss of trust, actually it's quite a big context really, but of a loss of trust in the media by its audiences, of coverage that is all too easily associated with vested interests, of a growing gap between public and private media, of worrying levels of concentration of ownership, of a shrinking and a defensive public service sector, I think that traditional normative attachments in the policy sphere are simply not strong enough, not robust enough, not radical enough to meet the challenges that we face. If the situation has changed, then I think that our guiding assumptions and, where necessary, our tools need to change. So when facing ultra-concentrated markets, both online and offline, a commitment to a plural media environment is neither sufficiently precise nor sufficiently bold to interrupt meaningful existing patterns of control. In an environment in which public service operators are being disciplined and undermined as a result of the attacks from their commercial rivals and under the guise of austerity, an uncritical defence of public service media is unhelpful if they are internalising neoliberal agendas and modes of operation. In a situation in which press freedom is used by billionaire proprietors as a defence against any form of independent regulation, then historic appeals to speech rights and individual liberties will fail to counter the power of corporate giants as they seek to undermine attempts to intervene in their markets. And finally, at a time when an increasing number of governments are involved in extensive surveillance of the digital activities of their populations, then the mere pursuit of a libertarian conception of ethics will prove useless against this unaccountable mobilisation of state power. We need instead, I believe, to adopt fresh policy frames and new strategies that are more concerned with principles like equality, social justice, and above all, a redistribution, a practical and meaningful redistribution of media resources, just as we need a redistribution of income and resources in order to protect public services and to lift people out of poverty. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to junk everything in our regulatory toolkit, but we do need to ask, I think, tough questions about what will work in an era of concentrated private power. To what extent does industry self-regulation that depends on large organisations monitoring their own behaviour adequately protect the public interest? To what extent can ministerial or parliamentary oversight be relied upon when political and media elites are increasingly intertwined? To what extent can competition law protect public services and the public interest in such a heavily commercialised political and policy-making environment? And I think in order to provide some sort of conceptual framework to answer these questions in the hope that we then develop the mechanisms that can work, it isn't enough to turn simply to the familiar liberal theories of power and policy making, that we do need more radical alternatives, that we should learn from media historians like, for example, Victor Pickard in the US, who critiques the role of what he describes as the, quote, nervous liberals, the people who use traditional democratic theory meekly, the idea that maybe the best the media can do is facilitate a singular public sphere or facilitate a marketplace of ideas to assess market failure, but who then themselves step short of advocating substantive social change. We also need to engage with the social movement theorists who see social change rooted in the possibility of what Lorenzo Mosca calls unconventional collective action, and who in recent years have started increasingly to engage with questions of media power and media counterpower. Now, from my perspective, the key debate really is about how we get reform and what kind of reform we want. There's a US policy analyst called Joe Karaganis who helpfully distinguishes, for me at least, between two, as he calls it, geographies of activism in relation to media reform. On the one hand, you have a kind of more civil and polite consumer rights model of policy advocacy, encapsulated in mainstream media reform strategies and underpinned by liberal political values that would include an emphasis on producing parliamentary submissions, on very quiet lobbying, on appealing to the best interests of policymakers and ministers. On the other hand, you have much more militant demands for communicative justice that emerge from movements that are much more concerned with questions of accountability and representation and voice in the media. And often the two don't speak to each other. For many social movement activists, the first type of liberal media reform, what you might describe as reform from above, is seen as potentially counterproductive in that activists are likely to be incorporated into official channels and persuaded to tailor their demands to meet the values and the values of vested interests more than anyone else. On the other hand, for seasoned media campaigners who focus exclusively on Parliament, cross-party approaches and pragmatic demands, you always heard the word pragmatic demands, are the only likely guarantees of success when faced with very difficult circumstances. And for them, so-called reform from below risks alienating the very people who they argue have the power to bring about change. So how do you address this tension between so-called modest reform demands and a much more deep-rooted programme of transformation, a tension that lies at the heart of many demands and movements for change? And I guess drawing on my research as well as my experiences inside different, the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom and the Media Reform Coalition, where we continue to both meet with figures inside Parliament, and we had a very good and interesting meeting last week with the Shadow Cabinet team who are talking about prioritising issues around media ownership. But at the same time as doing that, we continue to meet, very importantly, and to mobilise with groups outside Parliament. But in that tension and in all those complex debates, one thing for me is crystal clear, and that is any progressive campaign, whether it's against media concentration or it's against cuts to the NHS or it's against the marketisation of higher education, that any such progressive campaign needs to confront, not just to recognise, but to have the tactics and the strength to fully confront the power of vested interests who will try and block and marginalise the demands of the campaigners. I'm sure many of you in this room have felt that. We've certainly felt that inside the Media Reform Coalition, where we have been attacked, for example, by sections of the media as, quote, was it professors of evil, James, I think we were called, and regularly attacked as being enemies of free speech. And where you struggle simply to put issues of media ownership and control on the political agenda because there are simply too many connections between media and political elites to make this a comfortable area of reform. You need fully to confront the power of those groups to completely distort, marginalise and undermine your efforts. And so in these circumstances, it isn't a matter of just finding the right individuals or changing the mind of a top civil servant, as wonderful as that is when you feel you may have done it, except the civil servant then goes and receives instructions from other people. The fact is that flaws in media content, flaws in media governance, aren't due to the failures of individual journalists or individual programme makers or even individual politicians. They are a reflection of the highly unequal environments in which media content is produced, distributed and consumed. This is crucially a structural and not an individual problem. And that means that we need to create, not that the individuals are not important here, but the point is, how do we create the conditions for those individuals to be able to have to listen to our movements? So it's a point about creating sufficient pressure such that those individuals who do have the power to make the change will find it almost impossible to ignore our demands. Because there is, after all, I think, a world of difference between a campaign which confines itself to parliamentary spaces and calls on a handful of the so-called great and the good to plead its case, and one which seeks all the time to mobilise greater numbers of people using all the resources at its disposal. And the fact is, this is where it's tricky, getting the balance right about how a campaign should organise inside the media and beyond it. Because if reform campaigns are to secure durable and significant change, there's little point in aiming only at applying a band-aid to very deep cuts. But on the other hand, it's also the case that there's little point in refusing at least to treat the wound if activist movements are to grow and gain influence and win the participation of people who initially may not be willing to go all the way on that journey. So it's a question of taking all those demands seriously while at the same time recognising that significant lasting change will require much more than just damage limitation. So we need both to confront and to pose alternatives to the highly unequal power structures that dominate the media, but we also really need to take seriously those people who want to find solutions to current problems if we're going to try and mobilise effectively for meaningful transformation. And obviously such an approach requires an engagement with official structures, with formal legislative processes, with parliaments, with policymakers, with lobbyists and lawyers. In other words, it requires engagement with the very constituents of the system that many people, including myself, believe are responsible for a diminished and degraded media culture. But crucially, it also requires connecting with wider social forces, campaigning for social justice, who have to grapple daily, after all, with media outlets whose agenda-setting power is pretty decisive often to the successful outcome of their campaigns. If we are committed to efforts to transform media systems by campaigning, for example, to diversify media ownership, to introduce new forms of funding for marginalised content, to oppose surveillance, to press for more ethical forms of journalism, then we really need to think beyond those policy measures that are currently on the agenda. So we need to return to my previous point, to defamiliarise the whole policy process, to introduce new agendas, to introduce new frames, to press for remedies that are serious enough to make a difference. Now, all of you will have different views on this. Some of the things that we have been pressing for as part of a wider argument about the operation of power inside British society. You know, one way in is in recognition of the fact that the media are not telling our stories, and indeed are telling only the story, often tell the stories of only a narrow section of the population. We need to think of some demands that might start to mobilise people. So, I mean, again, there are all sorts that many people in this room have been working with. You know, just from my perspective, I think we should start to investigate the efficacy of measures such as introducing levies on the profits of the largest digital intermediaries, the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks. As I bore my students, Apple literally has more cash than it knows what to do with. It has, at the last time I saw, $110 billion. There's not much you can do with $110 billion. Apart from you could invest 1% of that, which would transform some of the narrative structures, the opportunities for telling stories. Now, Apple are very unlikely to give this up voluntarily. But why should it be a voluntary thing? Why should there not be a responsibility on the largest intermediaries to make a full contribution to the media environment in this country? So we should start to introduce levies. Now, sometimes you raise the word levy and people think it's impossible because it's a tax. Apart from when you remind people that levies have been going on in this country for many years in the film industry, and that you find levies all across Europe. So it's a political argument that we need to have. But there are a range of other demands that we should be campaigning for. We should, as the Media Reform Coalition is doing, we're talking about imposing behavioural obligations on our largest media organisations, such as, for example, independent editorial boards to curb the power of proprietors, for example, to introduce conscience clauses to protect journalists from unethical demands from their editors. We might, I don't know, for example, think about how best to institute some sort of democracy in the selection of editors. How radical would that be, or how commonsensical might that be? We might want to investigate ways to deal with the corrupting influence of advertising on editorial content. It was demonstrated by Peter Oborne's resignation as chief political commentator of the Daily Telegraph in protest at the title's lack of coverage of the HSBC banking scandal. Now, in all of this, I think media academics, and I guess, if I'm honest, academics in general in their different disciplines, but media academics for now, have a particular responsibility in this context to amplify these arguments about the flaws of an entrenched media power. Because I think we can do so much more than simply coming up with perfect models of media metrics that demonstrate our knowledge of media business models. We can be so much more productive than simply producing polished submissions to formal consultations, which are then ignored. And anyway, where an agenda is set and the decision is taken by other people. We can do so much better than develop normative positions around things that are constrained to just pluralism or free speech, which are so often hegemonized by forces who are very different, who have very different interests to our own, and also positions which seem to have very little purchase in the outside world, nor which actually challenge the existing distribution of media power. Indeed, I would suggest, in particular for those of us who are media researchers, teachers, students, audiences, that includes basically the whole of the population, that actually we don't have to see ourselves simply, if it's just in terms of people who are inside universities, we don't have to see ourselves as independent academics, so-called, but insist that it's okay to be activists who can embed the academic, the scholarly work we do in wider movements. That means to work with anti-austerity groups if we want to address the very narrow consensus in economic coverage. That we can work with minority communities if we're to seek better representation of all the voices in this country. That we should work actively with media unions if we're to press for example, more safeguards for journalists in the face of bullying editors. Joe Carriganis is right to point out in his words that systemic change requires a social movement capable of linking policy agendas with grassroots activism. And this isn't impossible. Even in those dark January nights, it is not impossible. We've seen vibrant movements for media democracy, online and offline. We've seen offline protests in places like Mexico City, Istanbul and Athens in recent years, where ordinary publics, not just some of the media reform activists, ordinary publics have decided that their lives have not been catered for. In fact, their lives are being corrupted by the existing existing media order, and where they have therefore mobilised against corrupt officials and unaccountable media moguls and called for media reform. Now, just to finish, in terms of this country, I have no idea whether Jeremy Corbyn will eventually have the confidence to press for the media reforms that he has promised to introduce. Natalie and I will go back and we will try and do what we can, but I have no idea whether he will find the confidence or be allowed to have the confidence to make these very difficult changes. But we really do need to disentangle the relationship between media proprietors and the political elite. We really do need to limit the ability of giant corporations to stifle and control public conversations. We really do need to challenge the laziest and most pernicious stereotypes where they come out of the media. And we do really need to free journalists from the constraints that stop them investigating the stories that do hold power to account. Now, I hope that someone like Jeremy Corbyn moves in this direction, but I suspect that the only way of guaranteeing it, that he at least attempts to do so, is through sustained public pressure for action, through appealing to the energy of his grassroots supporters rather than simply relying on a handful of experts or lobbyists like myself. Because after all, when it comes to it, if we all stand together with our umbrellas open, even the most low-flying pigeon won't be able to rain on our parade. Thank you very much. $50 minutes, is that all right? 50 minutes.
There is a tradition in Goldsmith's Inaugurals, no questions. It's for Des to profess and us to benefit, and no questions. Halfway through, I was thinking, someone said to me once, many are cold but few are frozen. I'm so sorry about the bloody temperature, but the energy and the zeal of Des offset that brilliantly. Yes, thank you so much. There is drink at the back. I hope to God there's hot drink at the back. Thank you so much for being here. What a great audience. What a wonderful inaugural. Thank you.
Thank you.